the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can seem impossible to comprehend. By looking at the year that most changed the lives of Israelis and Palestinians, 1948, it becomes possible to understand the forces that drive this conflict today. For Israelis, 1948 was a year of creation. The terrible injustices Jews had faced throughout the world would finally come to an end with the realization of their long sought-after solution, a Jewish state in Palestine. For Palestinians, 1948 was a catastrophe. That one year saw the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns, their inhabitants replaced by outsiders from Europe and Russia, and most Palestinians would never see their home again. In the 1800s, Jews across Europe and Russia suffered persecution in many forms. Racial stereotypes of Jews were rampant. Movements called for boycotting Jewish businesses. In many places, Jews were not allowed to attend universities, were forced to live in certain neighborhoods, and were prevented from entering roles in government. In other places, whole towns would rise up against their Jewish populations and attack them en masse, resulting in looting, robbery, rape, and massacres. Jews began to look for a way to end their suffering. Some came up with the idea to bring all of the Jewish people out of Europe and settle in a place where they could finally be secure. The place they chose was Palestine, and the movement, formed at the end of the 19th century, became known as Zionism. During World War I, the Zionist movement scored a major victory. The British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour declared support for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. A few weeks later, the British Army conquered Jerusalem and began implementing the Balfour Declaration. In the early years of the movement, calls for removing Arabs from Palestine were not often made publicly by Zionist leaders. But as larger and larger groups of Jews began arriving in the country, discussions about encouraging the native population to leave by purchasing their land or through other means began to spill into the open. In the 1920s, thousands of Arabs became homeless after Zionists purchased their land out from under them by making deals with wealthy landlords from nearby countries. The rise of Hitler in the 1930s led to a massive increase in Jewish immigration to Palestine. The Arabs watched the arrival of more and more Zionists, saw the growing number of those who had lost their homes, and heard pronouncements by some Zionist leaders that they had plans to one day outnumber the Arabs.
The Arabs revolted. In 36, 39, they revolted against the British and against the Zionist presence.
The leadership of the Zionist movement and the leadership of the Palestinian Arab population. They both have made the same diagnosis of their situation, and this is what they understand, that the establishment of any type of Jewish state in any part of Palestine where there was going to be a Jewish majority necessarily required the large-scale displacement of Palestinian Arabs.
The King David Hotel was the headquarters of the British government in Palestine. Its bombing in 1946 by the Irgun was by far the largest attack in the Zionist campaign against the British and was a massive shock to Palestine. It left 91 people dead, including Britons, Arabs, and Jews. In 1947, the British gave up on trying to find a solution between the Zionist settlers and the native population. Exhausted from World War II, the British declared that they would leave Palestine and handed the problem over to the United Nations. At the UN, a committee decided that the best way forward was to split Palestine in two, giving one state to the Jews and the other to the Arabs. Jerusalem would become a separate entity administered by the UN. The Jewish community in Palestine had skyrocketed throughout the Zionist movement. But in 1947, it still only represented 1/3 of Palestine's population and owned less than 7% of the land. The United Nations Partition Plan called for giving 56% of the country to the Jewish state. This proposal shocked the Arab community. Not only would the Jews receive over half of Palestine, but they were also receiving most of the land suitable for farming.
Nobody felt that this was a fair deal.
The overwhelming majority, more than 55% of a country that had a two-thirds Arab majority, was being given over to the minority. And the area that would have been given to the minority was almost equal in population between Arabs and Jews. So there was a negative reaction to the partition of the country at all. People felt it's a single country, shouldn't be partitioned. But then the specifics of the partition were found unjust and unequal in the minority was being given most of the country.
But in the wake of the Holocaust, world leaders felt compelled to do something for the Jewish people. In the United States, President Truman was facing re-election and intense lobbying by Zionist leaders. As a result of those pressures, he began supporting the UN partition plan.
Truman, you might say, unleashed American diplomats to threaten certain countries. So you change your vote or else. And it worked. The vote passed to have partition.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Partition passed, 33-13. And is this crowd excited? They're starting their horror dances now. All over the square, little circles are forming. People are laughing and crying and shouting and whirling around in the wild horror dance.
The British had announced that they would complete the evacuation of Palestine on the 15th of May. Zionist leaders began preparing for a Jewish state. On March 10th, the Haganah adopted Plan Dalet, also known as Plan D. This plan outlined an overall strategy for the Jewish militia. Its stated goal was to prepare the coming Hebrew state to defend itself once the British Army had left. But historians strongly disagree about the intentions of the plan.
It's geared, and it says that it's geared, to securing the Jewish state and the border areas and the main roads between the Jewish urban concentrations, to securing the Jewish state in advance of the Arab invasion.
It's completely ridiculous. I mean, it's very clear that Plan Dalet was a plan not just to take over, but to empty of their population all of these villages and cities. Now, were there people who understood that writing down on paper, we will expel this population, was probably not a wise thing to do? Yes. But was there a clear intention implemented to the letter to expel the populations, and more importantly, not to let them return? There was.
The most important part of Plan D was the set of orders that came outside of Plan D. The orders were strikingly clear and unambiguous, and used the word letaher in Hebrew, which is to cleanse, or to destroy, which is lehashmid, or to expel, which is legaresh. I think the role of the historian is to fuse these military orders with the plan itself, and then you get an idea of the intention and the implementation.